where Zelensky says Israel can be a broker for peace between Russia and Ukraine. Israel, which is based on the denial of peace and the promotion of war, which has attacked every one of its neighbours, sometimes many times, and now this is supposed to be a broker for peace. So the hypocrisy is terrible. How can we bring this to the direction of support for Palestine? We're trying. We're pointing out how white refugees from Ukraine are welcomed into Poland, but Syrians and Middle Eastern refugees are turned away sometimes at the border. The racism is very extreme in the EU borders.
The Israeli occupation government has started an all-out war against the Palestinian people, whether in occupied Jerusalem, in the West Bank, Gaza, even in Nazareth and Haifa, in historic Palestine. Now, international solidarity is a must in order to press international governments to pressure the Israeli government to stop this war against the occupied people of Palestine. To talk about that, I have with me the representative of the Scottich Palestine Solidarity Campaign from Scotland, Mr. Mick Napier. Welcome to the program, Mick.
Thank you for having me, Osama. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Mick, we saw how the Israeli occupation government launched its all-out war against the Palestinian people during the month of Ramadan. Every day we see the Israeli soldiers beating, injuring, running after Palestinians in Bab al-Amud in Jerusalem. We see what's happening in Jenin and other cities in the West Bank. They bombarded Gaza. They attacked people in Nazareth and Haifa, even inside the Green Line. So how do you see this aggression at this period of time by Israel?
Well, Osama, I'm not very clever, but it was easy to predict. And I predicted months ago that this Ramadan, Israel would have to escalate the repression and the killings and the beatings, because last Ramadan, when they were kicking Palestinian families out of their houses in East Jerusalem and making aggression against the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and at the same time, gangs in Israel in 48 were attacking Palestinians. It was a very brutal confrontation, but Israel didn't win. The resistance in Gaza fired some rockets. Israel replied with greater repression, but I think everybody who looked at the situation understood that Israel didn't have a clear win. It didn't crush the Palestinians. It wasn't able to say that they had succeeded in their goal, and therefore we could be sure that Israel wanted this Ramadan to try to cover up that shame, their shame, as they always need to win. You see, because Israel is surrounded by 350 million Arabs, even though the governments are with Israel, with the Israeli government, the great mass of people are not and are very sympathetic. Israel has to maintain what they call their deterrent edge. By that they mean their ability to terrorize successfully anybody who defies them. That means Palestinians, but also beyond Palestine. So this escalation by Israel could easily be anticipated, and this is what's happening. It's brutal, it's cruel, but this is what happens when you have an apartheid and colonial state who have a clear program to try to remove Palestinians from their homeland.
Yeah, and the Palestinian people are occupied people. They have no arms, no military power at all, and Israel kills the Palestinian civilians. Just 2 days ago, a Palestinian student, female student, Hanan Khdour, 17 years old, while she was on her way to her school, she was shot and injured in the car, and after that she surrendered to her wound and died. And other girls, other women, other children are targeted by the Israeli forces. Now, to help the Palestinians, stop this Israeli aggression, international solidarity is a must. So how can we activate solidarity in Europe, in the West, everywhere we can, in order to put an end to this aggression against the Palestinians?
You know, I don't want to promise what we cannot deliver. The pain and the agony of the Palestinians living in a giant prison is something that we all feel. All I can say is that in many parts of the world, solidarity is becoming, what can I say? In Oakland Port in California, they don't unload any Israeli ships, and that is since 2014, since Operation Protective Edge. Here in Britain, you see lots of people taking on Israeli arms companies and driving those Israeli arms companies into a closure. They've kicked them out of Oldham, which is a city in England. Here in Scotland, we managed to make sure the biggest arts festival in the world is free of Israeli presence, and so on and so on. There's better activities in South Africa, in France, and elsewhere. But it's never fast enough and it's never quick enough. But all I can say is to the Palestinians in their grim situation, that they have already won a big victory.
Yeah.
Because public opinion is already very hostile to Israel, despite the efforts of the mainstream media to present Israel in a positive light. So their struggle is not in vain, but we have to build up. I cannot tell you a timetable. I cannot say when we'll reach the stage where in South Africa they forced banks to withdraw and governments to boycott, to kick South Africa out of the Olympics. We're not there yet, Osama, but we have to keep on trying and working. And the Palestinians are an inspiration.
Yes, and my final question to you, Mick, you're talking about the Palestinians winning the battle at the level of the public opinion, okay? And you mentioned
yes.
the stream media in the West. And we see how they cover the Ukrainian crisis and how they keep pushing the people, pushing the governments, the different institutions to support the Ukraine fighters. Why, when it comes to the Palestinian struggle for justice, they accuse the Palestinians of terrorism. So in what context you see the Western mainstream media, and how can the public opinion that is on the side of the Palestinians affect the attitude of this media?
I don't think it can affect the attitude of this media very much. In the mainstream media, Israel is treated very, very positively, despite the crimes. But in terms of social media, Israel is losing, because that's where popular voices can come through. Look, I think it's, of course, there's terrible hypocrisy. Yeah, Palestinians throwing stones are terrorists. Ukrainians with Molotov cocktails are heroes. But we have to look beyond the disgusting hypocrisy. NATO is prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian in order to damage Russia.
Yeah.
NATO is determined to weaken Russia. You know, after Germany was reunified, the West promised Russia they would never move to the east. But they did. And when Russia applied to join NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union, really, it was refused. So we see on the one hand, NATO and the West strategically against Russia and using the Ukrainian people, just as they used the Afghan people. The Afghan people paid a horrible price because they supported the West against Russia, and the Ukrainians will also pay a horrible price. But in terms of Israel, NATO supports Israel. Israel's virtually a member of NATO. I mean, Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, he was greatly financed by an Israeli oligarch, Kolomoisky, Zelensky went to Tel Aviv many times to talk to Kolomoisky, who's a billionaire Ukrainian living in Tel Aviv. And when he was elected, with his money behind him, he made very big moves to support this particular oligarch, this particular billionaire. And now we see, I'm sorry, Osama, to talk about this, we see the ridiculous situation where Zelensky says Israel can be a broker for peace between Russia and Ukraine. Israel, which is based on the denial of peace and the promotion of war, which has attacked every one of its neighbors, sometimes many times, and now this is supposed to be a broker for peace. So the hypocrisy is terrible. How can we bring this to the direction of support for Palestine? We're trying. We're trying. We're pointing out how white refugees from Ukraine are welcomed into Poland, but Syrians and Middle Eastern refugees are turned away sometimes at the border. The racism is very extreme in the EU borders. So we have to point this out. We have to point out patiently and as strongly as we can that Palestinians are a nation of refugees, the victims of ethnic cleansing, barbarous regime, but we have to fight. We have no choice.
Yes. Scottich Palestine Solidarity Campaign representative, Mick Napier. It was a great honor having you in our program. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. And from me, Osama Nazal, have a nice time.